Welcome back. With the work of Clifford Geertz, we come more squarely into a much different branch of study with regard to the concept of culture that we've been investigating in this course, namely the developed discipline of cultural anthropology. We saw an indirect glimpse of some of the methods used in this discipline, in the way a sociologist like Pierre Bourdieu, for instance, collected statistical data and conducted surveys that formed the basis for his analysis of taste in the book Distinction. You'll remember from a previous lecture that when Bourdieu, as a young college graduate, was sent to French colonial Algeria, he developed an interest in studying that culture. So he trained himself as an anthropologist. He was influenced mainly by a man named Claude Lévi-Strauss, especially by a study Lévi-Strauss wrote called Structural Anthropology. This was, as you might also recall, about patterns of kinship and other persistent structures that underlie a wide range of apparently localized and particular forms of human behavior. In a unique way, Bourdieu's Distinction takes up as its subject the kind of culture we began with. That is, culture as refinement of manners and the products of intellectual and artistic production, associated with writers like Matthew Arnold, and Bourdieu treats it from a sociological or even an ethnographic point of view. This is why I suggest that the two large and different domains of culture come into play in reading Bourdieu. One, a kind of demystification of the Arnoldian view of that term, and the other, a methodological framework in part derived from the discipline of cultural anthropology. There are other reasons, too, for dipping into the cultural anthropology of Clifford Geertz at this particular point in our course. I'll mention two of them. First, on a practical level, it's good to keep in mind that Edith Wharton's novel, The Age of Innocence, published after the Great War in 1920, can be read in part as an ethnographic study of a generation of elite New Yorkers in the decade of the 1870s, in which the novel is set. In its close observation of social manners, geographical specificity, and material culture, the book evinces Wharton's deep immersion in what was then the emerging new field of cultural anthropology. I mean this in two senses. Both Wharton's wide reading in this field in the opening decades of the 20th century — she knew, for instance, the major works of Edward B. Tyler, Ruth Benedict, and others — and the occasional references by the book's narrator to works of evolutionary theorists and the kinds of anthropological studies that intelligent people were interested in reading during the 1870s. Beyond this, and perhaps more noticeably, is Wharton's own use of terms and descriptions in the book drawn from the disciplinary discourse of ethnography and cultural anthropology, words like tribe to describe the group of powerful New York families dominating the plot of the novel, or other words like sacrifice, ritual, and ceremony to track the social organization of the characters depicted in The Age of Innocence. Even to speak of an age in the book's title, whether it means the life stage of a person or an entire era now past, suggests a perspective assumed at some objective distance for the purpose of analysis. While these connections to the work of Clifford Geertz are useful to note, there is something even more relevant about his work for our purposes as students of literature. I should really broaden this by saying any student or practitioner of textual analysis, or decoding, or the interpretation of any elaborate system of signification. That's because Geertz's way of theorizing cultural anthropology brings it very close to the practice of literary analysis as we know it. As he defines it, culture is best understood as a semiological system, and man as a signifying being. We communicate, of course, through signs and symbols, but we also come to know ourselves as human beings through such signs. Out of this claim, Geertz developed a method and a name for interpreting or reading the elaborated sign systems of a given culture by one observing it from the outside. The concept is known as thick description, and the method has entered into contemporary literary analysis as a powerful expansion of the conventions of close formalist reading. Geertz lays out this principle in the essay you read entitled Thick Description Toward an Interpretive Theory of Culture. The specific practice we're talking about in cultural anthropology is called ethnography. It's an analysis that classifies human behaviors into meaningful groupings. By this I mean things like symbolic gestures or rituals that involve participatory ceremonies like weddings, wakes, funerals, etc., or coming-of-age events. In addition, the ethnographer takes note of kinship structures, social hierarchies, the evolution and dissolution of systems of power, control or organization or dominance within certain groups. Usually this requires meticulous, detached observation by a trained outsider who has earned the trust of those that she or he is observing. The position of the observer is, as we know, fraught with methodological and even perhaps ethical issues that have to do with the susceptibility to bias or cultural prejudices, unconscious or conscious assumptions brought into the field of study by the ethnographer. These need to be acknowledged and corrected for, to the extent that they can be. With such corrections, the ethnographer records, analyzes, and finally interprets the meaning of what she or he or they have read. And while this description of the process lends itself persuasively to the analogy of decoding a complex work of literature, the mode of semiological analysis is somewhat different from pure textual analysis. And that's because the semiologist is not looking at a written, completed text, but at a living form of signification that first must be turned into a text by the ethnographer before it can be fully explicated. The ethnographer both writes the text from an undifferentiated web of significations and meanings and is a reader of that text. The suffix graphy in the word ethnography means writing. The implications of this further elaborated thick description for literary analysis are best described by reevaluating the customary relationship assumed between the literary critic and the text that forms the object of their analysis. But how so? Well, take for example the many ways in which the literary text is not just itself a code to be read or understood and interpreted as a work of writing, but how it also encodes within it other semiological systems in its broader frame of cultural references. Issues and themes like divorce or adultery or crime and punishment, child rearing, ideas of status, habits of speech and dress, conventions of gender, etc., war and peace, value systems, and on and on. The way characters look and what they own or what they do not own, where they live and how they live, all reflect elaborate signification systems that can be read or decoded through and beyond the written text that lies before the eyes of the critic. And one more thing as well, just as the careful ethnographer brings to consciousness their own cultural biases in order to achieve a greater degree of objectivity in their work, the literary critic too can incorporate this distancing practice in reading those texts that seem closest to us in time and sensibility. Hard to do, certainly, but well worth trying. So, to summarize Geertz's place in our course of study, culture is an entire conceptual field in and of itself. With regard to ethnography, especially when we consider its rather marginalized status from the perspective of Marx's historical materialism. There, culture was subordinated to the economic mode of production and its attendant social relations of production, an efflux, as it were, of the so-called superstructure. There are important influences underlying the cultural anthropology of Clifford Geertz. Foremost among them is the work of the early British anthropologist Edward B. Tylor, whose writings in the latter half of the Victorian era were widely discussed by intellectuals and writers in a number of different fields. To a large extent, Tylor's work provides the foundation of modern anthropology, well into our own time. Tylor was born in 1832 and died in 1917. His essential belief was that all societies passed through stages of development, from savagery through barbarism to civilization. He is best known for a 2-volume work called Primitive Culture. The first volume was subtitled The Origins of Culture, which deals with ethnography, including evolution, linguistics, and myth. The second volume is called Religion in Primitive Cultures, which explores the spiritual aspects of cultural anthropology through a phenomenon called animism. Tylor's most significant contribution to the intellectual history of culture was a vast expansion of the kinds of things that constitute its study. Here, for example, is Tylor's famous definition in full, the same one Clifford Geertz cites as a launching point for his own essay on the idea of thick description. Tylor writes, "Culture, or civilization taken in its wide ethnographic sense, is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. The condition of culture among the various societies of mankind, insofar as it is capable of being investigated on general principles, is a subject apt for the study of laws of human thought and action. On the one hand, the uniformity which so largely pervades civilization may be ascribed in great measure to the uniform action of uniform causes, while on the other hand, its various grades may be regarded as stages of development or evolution, each the outcome of previous history, and about to do its proper part in shaping the history of the future. You might rightly suspect an underlying assumption of continual progress or of ever-advancing stages of increased civilization underlying this 19th century understanding of cultural anthropology. That is, it doesn't seem possible with this model to account for reversals in that progress or evidence of devolution in the various stages of development. The movement is decidedly linear, not cyclical, and one wonders, in reading novels like The Age of Innocence, or more pointedly Willa Cather's The Professor's House, both written after the almost apocalyptic destruction of Europe in World War I, how something like Tylor's model of culture can really mean anything anymore. But if we look at what Tylor has to say about what happens in this development, we get a hint about a slightly more complicated way of understanding the process. Tylor writes, "Among evidence aiding us to trace the course which the civilization of the world has actually followed is that great class of facts to denote which I have found it convenient to introduce the term survivals. These are processes, customs, opinions, and so forth, which have been carried on by force of habit into a new state of society different from that in which they had their original home, and they thus remain as proofs and examples of an older condition of culture out of which a newer has been evolved. Tyler goes on to explain that the serious business of ancient society may be seen to sink into the sport of later generations, and its serious belief to linger on in nursery folklore, while superseded habits of old world life may be modified into new world forms still powerful for good and evil. Sometimes old thoughts and practices will burst out afresh to the amazement of a world that thought them long since dead or dying. Here, survival passes into revival. Progress, degradation, survival, revival, modification are all modes of the connection that binds together the complex network of civilization. It needs but a glance into the trivial details of our own daily life to set us thinking how far we are really its originators and how far but the transmitters and modifiers of the results of long past ages. So you see from these passages that what Tyler calls survivals may very well linger on in meaningful ways, even well after the conditions that originally formed them have passed from history, and the newer conditions of life have surpassed the importance or cultural status these survivals once had. Another way to put this is to say that the dominant culture formed and sustained by the ruling class does not prevail in all areas of the general culture, and that in some cases cannot meet the needs and beliefs of every group or individuals in society. And when looked at this way, Tyler's survivals start to resemble what Raymond Williams refers to as residual cultural elements. You'll remember from reading Marxism and literature that Williams describes a similar phenomenon this way. By residual, I mean something different from the archaic, though in practice these are often very difficult to distinguish. Any culture includes available elements of its past, but their place in the contemporary cultural process is profoundly variable. I would call the archaic that which is wholly recognized as an element of the past, to be observed, to be examined, or even an occasion to be consciously revived in a deliberately specializing way. What I mean by the residual is very different. The residual, by definition, has been effectively formed in the past, but is still active in the cultural process, not only and often not at all as an element of the past, but as an effective element of the present. Thus, certain experiences, meanings, and values which cannot be expressed or substantially verified in terms of the dominant culture are nevertheless lived and practiced on the basis of the residue, cultural as well as social, of some previous social and cultural institution or formation. It is crucial to distinguish this aspect of the residual, which may have an alternative or even oppositional relation to the dominant culture, from that active manifestation of the residual, this being its distinction from the archaic, which has been wholly or largely incorporated into the dominant culture. It's useful to see how wide Tyler's influence has been in the case of Williams' work, and how Williams adapts and modifies the idea of survivals. One of these adaptations worth thinking about some more is to notice how Williams not only makes a case for the active, as opposed to archaic, component of residual cultural elements in the overall cultural process, but even assigns to them a potentially adversarial, alternative, or even oppositional capacity with respect to the dominant culture. We should keep in mind that Williams also explains that a great deal of residual culture becomes incorporated into the dominant culture. So it's important to emphasize the difference between those incorporated elements and those that remain actively residual. On pages 122 to 123 in the book Marxism and Literature, Williams provides some examples drawn from religion, rural life, and the monarchy, which helpfully clarify the distinctions he's making. Returning to Clifford Geertz now, let's begin with how he summarizes the contributions of Edward B. Tyler to ways of defining the concept of culture. They are mainly 1. A way of describing the total way of life of a people. 2. The social legacy the individual acquires from his group. 3. A way of thinking, feeling, and believing. With this definition, it would be worth investigating the proximity of these meanings to some of the definitions of another term we have been studying, ideology. 4. An abstraction from behavior, which means, in a way, stepping outside those behaviors to observe or describe them in abstract terms. 5. A theory on the part of the anthropologist about the way in which a group of people in fact behave. 6. Culture may refer to a storehouse of pooled learning. 7. A set of standardized orientations to recurrent problems. Or 8. The general term for learned behavior. 9. A mechanism for the normative regulation of behavior. In this sense, we're talking about the constraints and levels of mobility that are made possible by the culture, as well as the system of rewards and punishments doled out to demarcate those cultural boundaries at the same time they establish a system of values in society. 10. A set of techniques for adjusting both to the external environment and to other men. And finally, a precipitate of history. With this last definition, we come closest to the view of culture given to us by historical materialism, in which historical and economic development forms the generative base of the superstructure that includes many of the elements that we call cultural. What this demonstrates for Geertz is not just the conceptual scope of the concept of culture, but the sheer unruliness of using the concept as an analytical tool. Geertz's way around this problem is to discover a common denominator for all of these descriptions, which leads to this working definition that is Geertz's hallmark contribution. The concept of culture I espouse, and whose utility the essays below attempt to demonstrate, is essentially a semiotic one. Believing with Max Weber that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun, I take culture to be those webs, and the analysis of it to be therefore not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. It is explication I am after, construing social expressions on their surface, enigmatical. But this pronouncement, a doctrine in a clause, demands itself some explanation. What this means, again, is that the main work of the cultural anthropologist, which is called ethnography, is really to learn to read texts made of human gestures, decoding their meaning, and writing a text that explains that meaning. This is what the word explication means, an unfolding of meanings that are densely imbricated, concentrated into gestural signs that can be described on two levels of signification. The most immediate superficial or surface meaning is just that, a description of what the observer sees. But a thin description is also different from a thick description because the gesture or physical movement falls into the category of mere reflex, practical use, or any other function that lies outside the general realm of symbolic communication or social engagements requiring a shared understanding of a system of cultural codes. Geertz points to Gilbert Ryle's distinction between the boy with the involuntary twitch in his eyelid and the boy who deliberately winks. In the latter case, the wink is an intentional gesture made to communicate something. It's a gesture, in other words, that lends itself to thick description. The context that makes it interpretable as a fleck of culture, as Geertz calls it, includes the following conditions that are absent in the example of the involuntary twitch. The gesture is deliberate. The gesture is directed to someone in particular. The gesture is made to impart a particular message. The gesture is made according to a socially established code. And finally, the winker makes the gesture without cognizance of the rest of the company. In learning the cultural codes of those she or he is observing from the point of view of the ethnographer, these close observations of behavior as gestural signs is assembled into a reading, a text, or as Geertz puts it, really our own constructions of other people's constructions of what they and their compatriots are up to. Analysis is then a matter for Geertz of sorting out the structures of signification, the established codes, determining their social ground and import. This is where the method of thick description comes very close to literary analysis. In thinking about the text of Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence, for example, this analogy is doubly interesting. If you imagine yourself as someone who believes in the interpretive value of knowing the historically and culturally specific codes at work in the elite social group of Americans living in the 1870s, you will incorporate into your interpretation of the novel the elaborate language of flowers used strategically throughout the text, even though such codes may strike the modern reader as somewhat archaic. Certainly, this is not the only way to read flower imagery in the book, but it does get us to a thicker level of signification that amplifies how we understand this literary work. The other element that makes the novel so compelling in the context of this discussion is that what we are told of these characters and their social environment is not unlike an ethnographer's account of the behaviors of a tribe. After all, Wharton is writing the novel from the vantage point of 2 generations removed from the action of the book. So, for the literary critic, it is not just the historical specificity of the language of flowers that both Wharton and the reader encode into the text of the novel as an important structure of signification, but the entire historical context of the immediate post-war years of 1919 to 1920 in which Wharton wrote the book. The depiction of 1870s New York is colored by this retrospective lens, and that carries with it a series of meaningful projections and displacements that are themselves layers of signification to be explicated. Of course, all of this must also take into account our own views as readers, not just us as individual readers, but a certain kind of reader whose concerns, worldview, and cultural needs have been shaped by the historically specific period of the early 21st century. The ethnographer, in a sense like the kind of literary critic I'm describing here, is always faced with what Clifford Geertz calls a multiplicity of complex conceptual structures, many of them superimposed upon or knotted into one another, which are at once strange, irregular, and inexplicit, and which he or she must contrive somehow first to grasp and then to render. So for Geertz, culture is an acted document made of symbolic actions. From here, it's not hard to imagine 2 things from this conception of culture as a semiological system. First, that there's an important psychological component to it that requires all members of a given culture to interpret, internalize, and use the same systems of signification in order to be considered members of that culture. As a consequence of this cognitive necessity, culture carries with it a regulatory function. That is, variations, transgressions, or challenges to the governing system of coded and symbolic meanings will be construed by the culture as unacceptable forms of behavior. The goal of the anthropologist, according to Geertz, is not just to learn to communicate with other peoples whose system of signification is vastly different from ours, but in doing so to enlarge the universe of human discourse. Analogously, when the student of literature grapples with unfamiliar content, the examination of the layers of signification composing that work is a step in that same direction of expansion. The notable thing about this particular essay about thick description is how frequently Geertz makes this analogy. In short, he writes, anthropological writings are themselves interpretations, and second and third order ones to boot. He goes on to claim that they are thus fictions, fictions in the sense that they are something made, something fashioned, the original meaning of fictio, not that they are false, unfactual, or merely as if thought experiments. This is a helpful formulation, I think, not only as a way of thinking about ourselves and our jobs as literary critics, but also a way of reconceiving what the novelists we are reading are doing as writers. Wharton and Cather are fashioning an account of their culture, an account that includes within it the way that culture sees, in turn, other cultures, whether that means the long-vanished civilization of the indigenous Anasazi tribes of the American Southwest in The Professor's House, or a bygone class of society in New York in The Age of Innocence. Both books are fictions in the sense that Geertz means this term. There is a possible danger in this method, as Geertz himself admits later in the essay. The problem has to do with the live component of culture, by which he means the informal logic of actual life. This is where we see a real difference between literary analysis of a text and the ethnographic account of a living culture. Culture, to be sure, from everything we've seen about it in this lecture, is a symbolic system, one that we might assume can be known in its own terms. By isolating each of its elements and specifying the internal relationships among those elements, the ethnographer is then able to characterize the whole system in some general way, and this is the problem. Understanding the underlying structures, for instance, of which culture is a surface expression, or, thinking of historical materialism here, the ideological principles upon which it is based. We do something like this in formalist analysis as well, or what we call close reading of a literary text, in which we identify the components of a literary work to demonstrate the governing aesthetic logic underlying the whole composition. I'm talking here about pure close reading. That does not for instance, stray outside of the text, but focuses on its own linguistic arrangement. Just as this method shortchanges, I think, in some degree, the amplification of meanings that are embedded in the text, a structuralist approach to culture locks cultural analysis away from its proper object. To put this in Geertz's terms, coherence, he says, cannot be the major test of validity for a cultural description. We must gain instead empirical access to what we observe about symbols in their actual conditions of use and exchange by inspecting real events not, as he says, by arranging abstracted entities into unified patterns. I want to pause here to recognize a similarly important proviso voiced by another analyst of culture, Raymond Williams. You'll recall in Marxism and Literature that middle section of the book that describes the simultaneous overlay of different cultural phenomena such as residual and emergent culture. Even though Williams' book as a whole is highly theoretical and is meant to be, it does not calcify the abstract cultural processes that it describes by coercing all of them into a static theoretical system. Perhaps the most explicit evidence of his own resistance to this is the section on structures of feeling, which, as you will recall, is described as the most ineffable layer of the cultural dynamic, lying just below the level of articulation. The concept is intimately related to Williams' frequent invocation of lived experience, which in any cultural analysis is understood to evade the official account of life perpetuated mostly by the dominant culture. The idea of lived experience is really what Geertz means when he says more is needed than a systematic description of symbolic communication to study the whole of a culture. Cultural analysis, he writes, is or should be guessing at meanings, assessing the guesses, and drawing explanatory conclusions from the better guesses, not discovering, as he calls it, the continent of meaning and mapping its bodiless landscape. The whole point of a semiotic approach to culture is, as Geertz writes, to aid us in gaining access to the conceptual world in which our subjects live, so that we can, in some extended sense of the term, converse with them. Geertz has interesting things to say as well about the form this kind of writing should take. By that I mean ethnography that contrives its conclusions out of the delicacies of its distinctions, not the sweep of its abstractions, as Geertz writes. This is excellent advice, I think, for literary criticism as well, especially in light of the impulse many beginning writers have of overgeneralizing their reading of a novel, or closing down the internal contradictions or problems inscribed in the text, or feeling compelled to come to a final conclusion about what the text means or what lesson it has taught the world. For Geertz, it is the essay form that is most suitable for expressing the nuances of ethnographic research, and to a large extent this is true of literary analysis as well. We are usually taught the formulaic structure of a typical academic essay, but that adherence to structure was never intended to be the default template into which we fit our observations in a mechanical way just to complete an assignment. The best writers and thinkers know what's required, but find the flexibility within the prescribed form, making the essay an exercise in real thinking. The very word essay has its origins in to essay, meaning to try out, take a stab at, venture a thought, and that's the true spirit behind the very best samples of this genre of academic writing that we call the essay. Geertz puts it this way: the essay, whether of 30 pages or 300, has seemed the natural genre in which to present cultural interpretations and the theories sustaining them. And why, if one looks for systematic treatises in the field, one is so soon disappointed, the more so if one finds any. Geertz himself admits that he has never gotten anywhere near to the bottom of anything I have ever written about, either in the essays below or elsewhere. Cultural analysis is intrinsically incomplete, he says. What we are left with in conclusion is a challenge to our own writing. To turn one last time to Geertz's own way of putting this, the aim is to draw large conclusions from small, but very densely textured facts, to support broad assertions about the role of culture in the construction of collective life by engaging them exactly with complex specifics.